Michael Bennett had lived quietly on Sycamore Lane for nearly a decade, and in all that time, not a single neighbor had walked up to his front door with a complaint. Not one. His lawn was trimmed on schedule every Thursday in summer, every other week in fall. His garbage bins were pulled back from the curb by 7 in the morning, rain or shine. His holiday lights came down before January ended without exception. He was the kind of man who understood that living in a planned community like Maple Grove Estates came with obligations, and he had always met those obligations without protest, without drama, and without any need to make his compliance visible. He simply did what was right and expected nothing in return, not recognition, not gratitude, and certainly not the war that was quietly being prepared for him across the property line. The neighborhood had been his anchor through the hardest years of his life, and he had treated it accordingly with the careful, consistent respect of someone who understood the difference between a place where you live and a place that holds you. Maple Grove Estates had held him. He had never taken that for granted. He would never have guessed it was about to become the stage for a confrontation he had done absolutely nothing to invite. Maple Grove Estates sat in the quieter folds of suburban Connecticut, 40 minutes from the city, but a world apart from its noise and density. The streets curved gently through rows of well-kept colonials and craftsman-style homes, each one separated from its neighbors by carefully measured setbacks and landscaping that was inspected twice a year by the Homeowners Association. The HOA at Maple Grove was not merely a formality, not the kind of paper organization that existed in governing documents, but rarely appeared in daily life. It was for many of the residents a genuine institution, part civic body, part social hierarchy, part governing force that touched every decision from fence height to exterior paint color to the approved dimensions of front door wreaths. The community had its own internal logic, its own language of compliance and violation, and its own unspoken pecking order that everyone understood and almost no one acknowledged openly. The lawns were green and the gutters were clean and the driveways were sealed in spring, and all of this was in some quiet and collective way understood to be the right order of things. People here had chosen a certain kind of life deliberately. They had paid for it, and they maintained it, and they were most of them reasonably content within its boundaries. At the very top of the neighborhood's unspoken hierarchy, unchallenged for the better part of 7 years, sat Linda Harper. She lived in the largest property in the development, a brick colonial on the corner of Sycamore and Birchwood Drive, set back from both streets on a lot that was almost a quarter-acre larger than the average in the neighborhood. Her home had the air of a property that had been tended by someone who understood its visual power. The flower beds were replanted every spring and fall. The driveway was sealed without fail. The front door was painted a deep lacquered navy that managed to be both tasteful and just slightly more distinguished than everything around it. Linda understood the language of a well-maintained property, the way certain people understand the language of clothing as a form of communication, a signal about who you were and what you expected of yourself, and by extension of those around you. Michael had moved into the neighborhood as a widower in his early 40s with a young son named Caleb and a need for something solid to stand on. His wife, Rebecca, had died of a sudden cardiac event 17 months before he signed the papers on the Sycamore Lane house, and the move had been, among other things, an attempt to build a life that felt less like an interrupted one. He had chosen Maple Grove Estates for practical reasons, the school district, the commute, the size of the yard, but he had stayed for reasons that were harder to name and more important than practicality. Something about the rhythm of the place suited him, the way the mornings were quiet until about 7:30 when the first cars began pulling out of driveways and the neighborhood assembled itself into its daily version, the way autumn came through the oak trees on his property line with a color that seemed too saturated to be real. The way his neighbors had welcomed Caleb without making a production of it, the way the kid had been absorbed into the life of the street as though he had always belonged there. Michael had never remarried. He had not looked particularly hard for it, and after a certain point he had stopped looking at all. He had Caleb, he had his work as a structural engineer at a mid-size firm in the city. He had Tom and Carolyn Marsh next door, and Eleanor Vance across the street, and a handful of other neighbors whose company he genuinely valued. It was a life that fit him, and he was careful not to do anything that might damage it. He had never participated in HOA politics in any meaningful way. He paid his dues on the first of each month without being reminded. He attended the annual meeting when the calendar allowed and voted on the items put to a vote. He had once served on the landscaping subcommittee for a single year when Tom Marsh had asked him as a personal favor and had stepped down when the year was up and resisted all subsequent requests to return. The HOA governance as a social ecosystem held no appeal for him. He could see clearly enough what it was: a structure in which small amounts of power accumulated around certain personalities and became over time disproportionate to the actual stakes involved, and he wanted no part of it. He had real problems in his life and a finite amount of energy to spend on them, and he had long since decided that neighborhood association politics did not represent a worthy use of either. This made him in Linda Harper's field of vision essentially invisible, which was exactly what he wanted. He noticed the construction at Linda's house the way you notice any major disruption: gradually at first, then all at once, then in a way you can't stop noticing, even when you want to. The first sign was a pair of pickup trucks parked in her driveway on a Wednesday morning in early June, which he registered as a brief footnote while reversing out of his own driveway to take Caleb to his summer program. By Friday, there were 4 vehicles, a concrete truck idling at the curb, and 3 workers in hard hats clearing the area behind her house with shovels and a small tracked excavator that left deep parallel marks in the turf. By the following Monday, the footings were being poured. Whatever Linda was building, she had been planning it for a long time, and she was building it with the efficiency of someone who had made all their decisions in advance. The structure took shape over the following 3 weeks with a speed that seemed calibrated to minimize the window for objection. The framing went up quickly, pressure-treated lumber and engineered joists arriving on flatbeds early in the morning, the skeleton of the new wing rising against the summer sky with an energy that felt urgent. Michael watched its progress from his kitchen window while he made his coffee each morning, doing the kind of informal spatial reasoning that his professional background made automatic. The new structure extended considerably further back than the existing foot line of Linda's house, further by his estimate than the standard rear setback requirements for the neighborhood should have permitted. He was not a surveyor, and he knew his own estimate was informal based on sight lines and a general sense of the proportions involved rather than any measurement. He was also aware, and this awareness carried real weight, that Linda Harper was the person in Maple Grove Estates least likely to be in violation of any code. She was the HOA president. She wrote the violation notices. She knew the rules of the development and the local zoning code the way other people know their grocery lists, completely instinctively, without effort. If she was building an addition, she had the permits. She had the approvals. She had everything in order. He was almost certainly wrong, and he told himself so with some deliberateness, and he let the thought go. Others in the neighborhood were not so willing to let it rest. Tom Marsh leaned over the shared section of fence one evening in late June, with a beer in hand and the expression of a man who had something to say and was taking his time finding the right way to say it. He mentioned the addition. He said it looked big. He said he had walked past the back corner of Linda's lot during his evening run, and the new framing seemed to come awfully close to something. He gestured vaguely in the direction of the rear property line. Eleanor Vance was less circumspect when she caught Michael at the mailbox on a humid Thursday morning. She had been watching from her second-floor window, she said, and she had a clear sight line to the back of Linda's property from up there, and whatever was being built back there, it looked like it was going somewhere it ought not to go. She said this with the particular confidence of a retired school teacher who has spent a professional lifetime being right and knows how to recognize the feeling. Michael listened to both of them with the attentive, non-committal patience he brought to most things. He thanked them. He told them the city building department would examine the permits and catch any issues during the inspection process. He went back inside and did not call the building department because it was not his property and not his project, and he was not the kind of man who filed complaints about his neighbors. The letter from the HOA arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of July, slipped through his mail slot in the standard white HOA envelope with the Maple Grove Estates return address in the upper left corner. It was a formal enforcement notice printed on the association's official letterhead and signed at the bottom by Linda Harper in the neat controlled cursive that appeared on every piece of HOA correspondence he had ever received. The letter informed him that the association had received a concern. It did not specify from whom, which was standard language, but in this instance carried a particular weight regarding the placement of his rear fence. Specifically, it stated that based on visual observation by association representatives, the fence appeared to be positioned in a way that might constitute an encroachment on shared property lines or a violation of the development's recorded easements. In accordance with Article 7 of the HOA's governing documents regarding property line compliance, Michael was required to commission an official boundary survey conducted by a licensed surveyor within 30 days. The cost of the survey would be borne by the property owner. If a violation was confirmed, the fence would need to be relocated within 60 days at the owner's expense. If no violation was found, the matter would be considered closed, and no further action would be taken by the association. Michael read the letter twice at the kitchen counter, standing still in the clothes he'd worn on his morning run. He set it down. He stood at the window and looked out at the fence, the cedar privacy fence he had replaced 7 years ago when the original boards had rotted, installed by a licensed contractor built with a pulled permit positioned by a tape measure laid from the survey markers that had been visible and undisturbed in the corners of his yard for as long as he had lived there, 7 years. The fence had stood in that position for 7 years without a single question from anyone about where it was. Not one letter, not one informal conversation, not one comment at an annual meeting. The fence had simply been there, unremarkable, doing its job, invisible in the way that properly placed things are invisible. And now, 6 weeks into Linda Harper's rear addition project, the fence had suddenly become a concern. He was not a man who ran hot. He had learned in the years since Rebecca died that there was very little to be gained from allowing emotion to get ahead of information. Anger, in particular, had a way of consuming the energy you needed to actually solve the problem. He felt what he felt, a cold, clear recognition of what the letter was, and then he set that feeling aside and began thinking practically. He would need a surveyor. He would need one he had not chosen with Linda's approval or under any influence she could claim to have exerted. He would need the process to be unimpeachable. He went to his office and opened his laptop and began looking for land surveying firms in the county. He drove to the community center the following afternoon and asked at the HOA management office if Linda was available. She came out to the conference room within 5 minutes, which told him she had expected this. She sat across from him with her hands folded on the table and her expression arranged in the manner of someone who was professionally certain she was right and had decided in advance that nothing he said was going to complicate that certainty. She told him the association had an obligation to protect the recorded boundaries of the development. She told him the fence had always looked slightly off to her, a statement he found almost impressively false given 7 years of silence on the matter, and that she was simply fulfilling her obligation as president by requiring the appropriate documentation. She said she was sure everything would turn out fine, which was the kind of thing you say when you are absolutely certain it will not. Michael listened without interrupting. He told her he understood her position and that he would arrange the survey. He stood, thanked her for her time, and left the building at a pace that communicated neither urgency nor unease. He called Hargrove Land Services the following morning. They were a county firm with more than 3 decades of local survey work on record, the kind of company whose name appeared in the acknowledgments of subdivision plats and property dispute resolutions throughout the region. The scheduling coordinator told him they had availability in 2 weeks and that a standard residential boundary survey would run between $1,400 and $1,600, depending on parcel complexity. Michael gave her his address, confirmed the date, and hung up without discussing it further. He did not notify Linda. He did not mention it at the next HOA newsletter circulation. He had no obligation to, and he saw no reason to. The morning the Hargrove team arrived was a thick August morning, the kind where the air settles on your skin before 7, and the light slants through the trees at the slow angle of a day that knows it has time. 2 surveyors arrived in a white company truck at 7:45 and introduced themselves with the relaxed professionalism of people who had done this particular kind of work thousands of times and no longer found it remarkable. The lead surveyor was a man named Gerald Oakes, solidly built in his late 50s, with a face that had been outdoors in all weather for so many years that it had settled into a permanent expression of calm attention. He shook Michael's hand, explained briefly what the process would involve and approximately how long it would take, and then walked around the perimeter of the yard with the particular unhurried gaze of a man who is reading the land before he starts measuring it. The total station, a laser theodolite mounted on a precision tripod, was set up at the established control point near the rear corner of the property. The second surveyor moved systematically through the yard with a prism pole, stopping at reference points, while Gerald tracked the positions through the instrument and called out readings that were logged automatically in the field data collector. Orange-tipped survey stakes were set at the confirmed boundary positions. As the measurements accumulated, each one driven into the ground with a small maul and left upright as a visible marker of where the property line existed in the physical world. It was methodical, unhurried work, and it had the effect of making the whole enterprise feel incontrovertible, because it was. By 9 in the morning, 3 neighbors had appeared in their yards with the studied nonchalance of people trying not to look like they were watching. Tom Marsh had found something requiring urgent attention among his climbing roses, though he was facing largely the wrong direction. Eleanor Vance had developed a sudden need to sweep her back steps with great thoroughness. A younger couple 3 houses down made no pretense at all and simply stood at their back fence watching with open interest, arms folded, coffee mugs in hand. The survey of Michael Bennett's property had become, without any announcement or invitation, the neighborhood event of the morning, which said something about how starved Maple Grove Estates had been for a story that cut in a new direction. Linda Harper appeared at her kitchen window at 9:23. Michael noticed her there, backlit by the interior light of her kitchen, perfectly still, watching the orange stakes accumulate along the rear boundary of his property. He did not look at her for long. He refilled his coffee from the carafe he had brought outside and turned his attention back to Gerald Oakes and the work. Gerald was crouching near the base of one of the fence posts, checking its position against the reading he had just taken, and he held that position for a moment, a long moment, measured not in seconds, but in the particular quality of attention a professional gives when something confirms what he already suspected, and then he straightened up and made a note and moved on. By 11:30, the measurements were complete. Gerald Oakes had packed the total station back into its case, retrieved the data collector, and was standing with Michael on the back porch with his field notebook open and his reading glasses perched at the end of his nose. He traced the recorded boundary lines with a blunt finger and delivered his findings without preamble. Michael's fence was in the correct position. Every post fell within the recorded boundary of his property as established by the original subdivision plat and confirmed by the recorded deed. There was no encroachment. There was no easement violation. The fence was exactly where it was supposed to be within normal measurement tolerance and had been from the day it was installed. He then said he needed to mention one additional finding. In the course of establishing the boundary at the northeastern corner of Michael's parcel, the survey had necessarily confirmed the location of the shared property line along the rear of the adjacent parcel, which was Linda Harper's property. Having established that line with precision, Gerald's team had observed that the new structure currently under construction on Linda's parcel extended approximately 9 feet and 4 inches beyond the rear setback line as established in the original subdivision plat and recorded in the county register. A portion of the addition, specifically the eastern section of the new foundation and the framing above it, was situated outside the buildable envelope as defined by the HOA's own recorded covenants and by the local zoning ordinance applicable to this zoning district. Gerald delivered this information with the same professional steadiness he had used to deliver the findings about Michael's fence. He was not editorializing. He was reporting. He said the finding would appear in the formal survey report as required by his firm's professional obligations, that the report would be filed with the county recorder in the normal course, and that it would in all likelihood come to the attention of the municipal building department through standard document exchange protocols. Michael stood very still on his back porch for a moment that was longer on the inside than it appeared from the outside. He looked at his fence. He looked at the fresh orange stakes marking the corners of his property. He looked across the line at the framing of Linda Harper's rear addition rising against the heavy August sky with the unhurried confidence of a structure that had no idea how much trouble it was in. He thanked Gerald Oakes. He asked him to proceed with the filing as a matter of professional course. He went inside and made sandwiches for himself and for Caleb, who was home from his summer program and wanted to know why there had been a truck in the driveway all morning. The formal survey report was delivered to Michael's email within 48 hours and simultaneously filed with the county recorder's office and forwarded, as Gerald had explained it would be, to the municipal building department as a component of the standard documentation protocol. Michael read the full report carefully. He forwarded his copy to the real estate attorney who had handled his original property purchase, a methodical and unsentimental woman named Patricia Yuen, who had, in Michael's experience, exactly the right temperament for problems of this kind. She reviewed the report and confirmed that its findings were straightforward and that the encroachment was significant enough to fall outside the discretionary relief available through standard variance procedures. She told him he should simply let the process run and not do anything to accelerate it or appear to be driving it. He thanked her and told her that was already his plan. The building department moved with an efficiency that surprised him. Within 6 days of the survey, filing a white city vehicle with a municipal seal on the door appeared on Sycamore Lane and parked in front of Linda Harper's property. A woman in a gray safety vest and hard hat walked around the side of the house to the rear. She carried a clipboard and a camera, and she was thorough. She spent nearly 40 minutes in the back of the property taking measurements and photographs and making notes at intervals that suggested she was being careful about what she was documenting. Michael did not go outside while she was there. He watched from his study window for a few minutes and then went back to his work. What he did not witness, but learned about from Tom Marsh during a conversation over the back fence that evening, was Linda Harper's encounter with the inspector. Tom had been in his garage with the door open and had seen most of it from the side. He said Linda had come out of the house with a folder full of documents and had met the inspector at the rear of the property with the focused energy of someone who was very certain she had prepared correctly. She had offered the building permits. The inspector had looked at them, and then at the survey, and then at the structure, and then had taken more photographs. Tom said Linda's voice had risen in pitch, not loudly, not out of control, but audibly noticeably, in the way that voices rise when the documents are not saying what you expected them to say. The inspector had thanked her politely and returned to her vehicle and driven away. And Linda had stood in her driveway for a moment after the car disappeared around the corner with the particular stillness of someone who is processing information that has not yet fully arrived. The notice of violation was posted 4 days later, a red-bordered official notice from the city building authority affixed to the framing of the rear addition in the location prescribed by municipal code for stop work orders and violation notices. The notice stated that the structure under construction had been found to extend beyond the permitted setback boundary, that construction must cease immediately pending formal review, and that the property owner had the right to request a hearing before the Zoning Board of Appeals. A certified letter conveying the same information was mailed to Linda Harper as property owner and to her contractor of record. The construction crew, which had worked through the summer with consistent professionalism, did not appear the following morning or the morning after that. The framing stood as it was unfinished in the August heat, and then the August rain, and then the early September warmth, waiting for a resolution that would take the better part of 2 months to arrive. The neighborhood processed what had happened in the way communities process sudden reversals of power, carefully, incrementally, and with a mixture of surprise, and something that was not quite its opposite. People who had received violation notices from Linda over the years for infractions that ranged from the minor to the barely perceptible began talking more openly about those experiences. Not with cruelty, not with the activated pleasure of watching someone fall, but with the loosened candor of people who had been holding something a certain way for a long time and now felt the permission to set it down. Patricia Hollis, 2 blocks over, mentioned at the mailbox station that she had been cited for her front door wreath being put up before the approved post-Thanksgiving window by approximately 4 days. She had taken it down immediately. She had replaced it on the correct date. She had not mentioned it to anyone until now. David Kim, who had moved in 3 years prior, said he had received 2 formal citations in his first year for issues that his research suggested were not being enforced uniformly. He had spent time and money correcting things on the assumption that he was in the wrong. He was now considerably less certain about that assumption. These were not dramatic stories. They were small ones, each minor in isolation, significant only in the accumulation in the pattern they revealed when you held them together and looked at them honestly. Michael stood at the periphery of these conversations and contributed nothing to them. He was genuinely not interested in the audit of Linda Harper's tenure, and he was careful whenever the subject came near him to say that he hoped the situation would be resolved properly through the appropriate process, and that he had confidence in both the city's review and the survey's accuracy. He meant both things without reservation. He was not performing restraint. He simply had no appetite for anything that went beyond the factual the fence was legal, the addition was not the city would sort it out. Anything beyond that was noise, and he had always had a low tolerance for noise. Linda hired an independent surveying firm within 2 weeks of the stop work order. The survey, commissioned at her expense from a company based in a neighboring county presumably chosen for its distance from anything connected to the Hargrove filing, took 10 days to complete. Its findings were forwarded to the city building department and attached to the formal appeal she subsequently filed with the zoning board. The results of the second survey were in all material respects identical to the first. The rear setback violation was confirmed at 9 feet and 2 inches, a 2-inch difference from Gerald Oakes's original measurement, a discrepancy well within the accepted margin of error for boundary surveys of this type, and one that no credentialed professional would characterize as a meaningful disagreement. The structure was where it was. The line was where the line was. 2 independent survey teams working from the same recorded plat data had arrived at the same conclusion within inches of each other. The Zoning Board of Appeals convened a formal hearing on Linda's appeal 6 weeks after the stop work order. She attended with an attorney. The hearing lasted 2.5 hours. Michael was not a party to the proceeding, had not filed any comment or correspondence in connection with it, and was not present. He received the board's written determination in the mail approximately 2 weeks after the hearing concluded. The determination was 14 pages long. Its conclusion in plain terms was this: the addition as constructed was not in conformance with the applicable rear setback requirement. The encroachment of 9+ feet exceeded the threshold for discretionary variance relief under the applicable code provisions, and no legally available mechanism existed to legalize the structure as built. The non-conforming portion of the addition, specifically the eastern section of the foundation and framing, was required to be removed and the site restored to its pre-construction condition. Linda Harper was given 90 days to comply. The determination was dated and signed and stamped with the board's official seal. It had the weight and finality of documents that have exhausted the available arguments. Linda did not appeal to Superior Court. The 90-day compliance window passed without any filing of the kind. Whether this decision was made on the advice of her attorney, who had presumably assessed the probability of success in a de novo review and found it unfavorable, or on the basis of financial calculation, or out of some private reckoning that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with exhaustion, whatever the reason, she did not appeal. She complied. The contractor came back to Sycamore Lane on a Thursday morning in early October when the maple trees along the street had turned the particular deep red that made them look in the morning light like something from a painting. The crew maneuvered their equipment through the side yard and marked the non-conforming portions of the framing with orange spray paint, and then they began the process of taking apart what they had spent the summer building. Demolition sounds different from construction. Construction accumulates. It adds things to the world in a sequence that feels productive, even inevitable, each board and beam placed in service of a shape that is gradually revealing itself. Demolition subtracts. It is irregular pausing, full of silences between the bursts of the saw and the thud of material falling. It sounds from the inside of a neighboring house like an argument that cannot be won being had in a language you mostly understand. Michael stayed inside both days the crew was working. He made no particular effort to avoid looking out the window, but he found that he simply didn't. He had no desire to watch. Whatever satisfaction was available in the spectacle of Linda Harper's addition being disassembled did not feel like satisfaction that was worth having. He made dinner for Caleb both evenings, helped his son work through the history essay that was giving him trouble, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. He slept without difficulty. The neighborhood was quieter than usual during those 2 days of demolition. Not the silence of avoidance, which has a particular tightness to it, but the deeper quiet of people who have witnessed something resolve and are still working out what the resolution means for what comes after. Tom Marsh came by the evening the work ended and said, standing at the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets, that the addition looked considerably smaller now. He said it carefully and without any particular satisfaction in his voice, the careful way that a genuinely decent person says something true when they're not entirely sure how to feel about the fact that it's true. Michael said that the contractor would presumably be back in the spring to finish it to code, and that it would probably be a nice addition when it was done properly. He meant this as a sincere observation, and Tom took it that way. The HOA's character changed in the months that followed, and the change was visible in the small details that accumulate into something meaningful over time. Linda did not resign from the presidency. Her term had nearly a year remaining, and she served it out. But the monthly newsletters became shorter and less detailed. The enforcement notices arrived less frequently, and when they did arrive, concerned matters of genuine shared concern rather than the particular and occasionally mysterious selections that had characterized the previous years. The spring election came without Linda's name on the ballot. She did not put it forward, and no one asked her to. The new president was a man named Robert Gallagher, a retired civil engineer, methodical and genuinely uninterested in using the role for anything beyond what it was supposed to be used for. He ran on a simple platform of reduced overhead and clearer process, and he won without opposition. Michael voted for him on a cold afternoon in late March, dropped his ballot in the collection box at the community center, walked to his car through a light rain, and went home to start dinner. There were moments in the months that followed when Michael thought about the whole sequence of events with something approaching wonder. Not pride. Pride felt like the wrong instrument for what he was feeling, too sharp-edged, too directional. Something quieter, a kind of steady astonishment at the geometry of the thing, at the almost architectural precision with which Linda Harper had constructed her own undoing. She had looked at her rear addition project and identified Michael's fence as a useful vulnerability, a point of uncertainty she could weaponize to create procedural noise around her own project, to establish a counter-narrative that might diffuse scrutiny before it could focus. She had deployed the full formal authority of the HOA to require a survey she was certain would find nothing of consequence. It was a defensible strategy. It might have worked. But to execute it, she had needed Michael to call a surveyor. And the surveyor, in doing exactly the professional work that Michael had hired him for, had done it completely, had measured the boundary lines with precision, that left no room for interpretation, had documented everything that fell on both sides of those lines with equal thoroughness, and had filed a report that described the world as it actually was. She had handed him the tool. She had explained exactly how to use it. She had not understood in doing so that it would illuminate more than she intended. He thought about this not with gloating, but with a recognition that had settled into something like gratitude. The truth, when it is genuinely on your side, does not require you to fight for it with particular ferocity or ingenuity. It requires only that you create the conditions in which it can be seen. Linda had created those conditions herself. She had done it out of confidence, the specific confidence of someone who has exercised authority long enough to begin confusing it with accuracy, to start mistaking the power to enforce with the power to determine what is real. The survey had not been a weapon Michael deployed against her. It had been a lamp she lit in a room she had not fully inspected, and when the light came on, it had illuminated exactly what was there. He stood in his backyard on a November afternoon with a mug of coffee going cold in the November air, and looked at the survey stakes, 3 of the orange-tipped markers still visible at the established corners of his property, left in place by Gerald Oakes as a standard courtesy to the homeowner. The fence ran along the lines, those stakes defined solid and unchanged 7 years old, and every inch of it exactly where it had always been, where it had always been legal, where it had always been right. Across the boundary line, Linda Harper's house sat quiet in the flat afternoon light. The addition, reduced now, squared off cleanly at the legal boundary wrapped in house wrap against the winter, waited for the warmer months when the contractor would return to finish it properly. It would be smaller than she had planned. It would sit entirely within the lines where it was always supposed to sit. It would eventually be a room of some kind, finished and functional. And the story of how it came to be that size and in that position would either be forgotten or it would not, depending on how people decided to carry it. Michael finished his coffee and went inside. The kitchen was warm. Caleb was at the table with his headphones around his neck and his textbook spread open and his phone face down, which meant he was actually working, which was the sign Michael had learned to look for. The soup on the stove had been going since noon, and the smell of it had reached every room in the house. The afternoon was his, and it was quiet, and it was entirely ordinary. He had not asked for the conflict that had come to his door in July. He had not sought a victory or a lesson or a reckoning. He had hired a surveyor because a letter told him to. He had let the surveyor do his job completely and honestly, and he had let the paperwork travel wherever the paperwork needed to go. And the result? The outcome that Linda Harper had set in motion on a Tuesday morning in July, with a signature on an enforcement notice, was that the truth of the property lines had been established completely and permanently for every parcel involved, both his and hers, by the same instrument on the same morning through the same act she had initiated with such confidence and such certainty of what it would reveal. It was the kind of ending that did not announce itself as an ending. It simply arrived quietly in the form of an ordinary afternoon and settled in and stayed. The weeks that followed Linda's compliance had a particular texture that Michael found himself noticing more carefully than he expected. He had assumed the resolution would feel like a door closing, the clean, final sound of a matter properly concluded, but what he actually felt was something more gradual. Like the way a room returns to its natural temperature after a window has been open in winter. Things adjusted. The air shifted. The neighborhood did not transform overnight into something it had never been, but the particular quality of its daily life changed in ways that were small and taken separately, easy to dismiss. The morning drives past Linda's house, for instance. In the years before the summer of the survey, he had never paid her property any particular attention on his way in and out. It was simply a large house on a corner lot, part of the visual vocabulary of the street. Now, for a few weeks at least, he noticed it the way the new addition stood against the tree line, reduced and neatly contained the orange house wrap bright against the gray of November. And then he stopped noticing it again, and the house receded back into the ordinary background of the neighborhood. That was its own kind of conclusion. Caleb, who was 16 and sharper than he sometimes let on, had asked about the situation once directly, about a week after the demolition was complete. He had been washing dishes after dinner while Michael dried, which was their established rhythm on the nights they were both home, and he had asked without preamble what was going to happen to the lady across the way with the half-finished addition. Michael had told him briefly and without embellishment what had happened, the survey, the findings, the cities ruling the demolition. Caleb had processed this for a moment and then asked a question that Michael had not expected, which was whether Michael had known all along that the survey would find something wrong with her addition. Michael had thought about this honestly before answering. He said no, not known, but suspected, and the distinction mattered. He said the survey had been required of him, and he had arranged for it to be done as completely and honestly as possible. And the truth that came back from it was not something he had manufactured or directed. It was simply what was there. Caleb had nodded and handed him the next dish and asked if there was anything else to eat, which was the signal that the conversation had reached its natural end. Michael had found him a bowl of leftover soup and thought not for the first time that his son was going to be all right. Eleanor Vance stopped him on the sidewalk one morning in December when the first real cold of the season had arrived, and the oak trees along the property lines were bare, and the whole street looked more exposed and honest than it did in summer. She was wearing her winter coat, the green wool one she had been wearing for as long as Michael had known her, and she had a canvas bag of groceries on each arm. She thanked him, which he had not expected. He asked her what for. She said for handling the whole thing the way he had, without making it into something ugly, without going to the papers or stirring up more than was necessary. She said she had watched it all from her window and from her front porch and from the conversations at the mailbox station, and she had noticed that he had never once said a word in public that was designed to hurt anyone or to make himself look better than the situation required. She said she appreciated that. She said she had been in this neighborhood long enough to see disputes handled badly, and this was not that. Michael thanked her for saying so. He helped her carry the grocery bags to her front steps, declined her invitation for tea because he had a 9 o'clock call, and walked back to his house in the cold morning air, feeling for a moment genuinely at ease in a way that had nothing to do with winning or losing, and everything to do with having been through a situation that offered many temptations to the contrary, precisely the person he wanted to be. Robert Gallagher, the new HOA president, sent his first newsletter in April, a single-page letter, plain formatted, with no decorative border and no subcommittee reports and no itemized list of upcoming violation inspections. It contained 3 announcements, the date of the spring community cleanup information, about a proposed adjustment to the gutter maintenance schedule that the board would be voting on at the annual meeting, and a reminder that the approved paint color palette had been updated and was available for review at the community center. Michael read it in under 2 minutes and set it in the recycling bin with the particular satisfaction of a document that has done exactly what a document of its kind should do, and nothing more. He did not think about Linda Harper when he did this. He simply thought this is how it should work, and moved on. The spring came into Maple Grove Estates the way it always did, gradually, then suddenly with the forsythia first, and then the magnolias, and then the full canopy of the oaks coming back leaf by leaf until the street was enclosed again in its summer green. Linda Harper's contractor returned in May to resume work on the addition. Michael heard the trucks on a Monday morning and looked out the kitchen window and saw the familiar white pickup and the flatbed with lumber strapped to it. The framing went back up over the following 2 weeks this time, within the correct boundary set back from the line by the margin the code required. The addition would be smaller than Linda had originally intended. This was simply true, and it was simply the consequence of having planned incorrectly, but it was proceeding and the work was clean, And by early June, the roof was on and the windows were rough-framed, and the structure had the shape of something that would eventually be a real room in a real house. Michael watched this progress with no particular feeling and went about his day. He had one brief encounter with Linda during that spring in the parking lot of the grocery store 2 miles from the neighborhood. It was a Saturday morning in mid-April. He was returning his cart to the corral, and she was walking toward the entrance with her own cart, and they saw each other at the same moment at a distance of perhaps 30 feet. There was a pause, not a long one, but a real one, the kind where 2 people assess what the moment requires of them. Michael raised a hand in the kind of neutral acknowledgement you give to someone whose history with you is complicated and recent and not yet fully metabolized. Linda returned the gesture, a small lift of the hand, and walked on. He walked on. They did not stop. They did not speak. They did not need to. The geometry of the parking lot and the small choreography of the moment said everything that needed to be said about where things stood, which was in the plain light of accuracy with no residual claim on either side. He thought about her sometimes in the months that followed in the way you think about people who have shown you something about the nature of power by misusing it in front of you. He did not think about her with anger or with pity, though he recognized both as available options. He thought about her as someone who had for a long time operated under a set of assumptions about how things worked, about the relationship between authority and truth, about the durability of reputation as a shield, about what it meant to be the person who sent the letters, and who had discovered in the course of a single July morning that those assumptions had limits she hadn't known were there. That was not a small thing to discover about yourself, whatever it had cost her financially, reputationally, in the private accounting that a person keeps of who they believe themselves to be. He had no appetite to add to it. The city had extracted what was due. The boundary lines had been drawn accurately, and they would remain that way. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. And so, Maple Grove Estates settled back into itself the way places do when the disruption that was necessary has finished being necessary. The streets curved the same way they always had. The lawns were trimmed on schedule. The garbage bins came in from the curb by 7 in the morning. Michael Bennett continued to live exactly as he had always lived, quietly, honestly, without making his decency into a performance or his patience into a posture. He trimmed his lawn on Thursdays. He attended the annual meeting. He voted when there was something worth voting on. He did not run for any committee seat, did not submit any proposals to the board, and did not involve himself in the governance of the neighborhood beyond the baseline that good citizenship required. The orange survey stakes in his yard weathered through the fall and the winter, and were eventually replaced the following spring by a new set cleaner and brighter, when Gerald Oakes's firm filed the updated plat documentation with the county. The lines were where they had always been. They would remain there. And Michael Bennett, who had never asked for any of this and had handled all of it with a steadiness that his neighbors would remember long after the specifics had blurred, went on living his life inside them exactly where he had always been, exactly where he had every right to be.